let me just talk you through this, the beginning of this document. I mean, I think hopefully you'll know a lot of this stuff anyway, but there's things here that I think are very important about the IELTS exam and how you answer the questions. So I want to talk you through that so that I don't skip something. I give this introduction to everybody when they start classes. So you can see the table there has got it's the basics of IELTS speaking. So these are the things that I think are the most important things about each part of IELTS. And there's some hyperlinks there after the class or in between classes. You can go to those hyperlinks and you'll find some more information. So the first thing is part one, obviously, and the questions there are short questions. You'll know because you've done the exam already. And I've underlined that they are about you. Actually, I would say maybe 80% of the questions in part one are about you, and 20% of the questions are more general questions, like, about people in your country or people everywhere. What do people like? So you've got to listen carefully to the question, and if it's about you, then you speak about yourself, and if it's about people more generally, it's a common mistake, because often when I'm asking the questions in the class, I ask the question about you or about people in general, and people speak about themselves. And although it might be a very good, grammatically, it might be a perfect answer, but it's not answering the question that's being asked. And so for the examiner, you'd get nothing for that answer because you're not answering the question. So that's why I'm drawing attention to it. You must listen to whether it's about you or about people in general. Okay, so it's an important point. The other thing is about the order in which you answer the question. And although it's actually not the way I would answer. If somebody asked me a question, I would give an explanation first, and then I'd give them the answer at the end. And so, it's a natural way for some people to answer a question. But there are different examiners, and they have different styles of asking questions in the IELTS exam, and sometimes it trips people up. Because if you're giving a long explanation and then you're going to give the answer after the explanation, some of the examiners cut you off. They don't let you give long answers. So they cut you off, and then they'll do, because what they want to do is they want to ask you maybe 15 questions in part one. And so they need to get through, because that's their style of doing the exam. It shouldn't be like that. It should be the same for every examiner, but it's not, unfortunately. So for those examiners that cut you off, if you haven't given a direct answer to the question, if you haven't got to your direct, like the yes or no or whatever it is, or the actual answer to the question, if they cut you off and you haven't answered it, then again you're going to get 0 for that because you haven't answered the question. So because of their style of asking questions, they're cutting you off, and they say, well, you didn't answer the question, but it's their fault because they cut you off. So the way to get around that is to always give a direct answer first and follow it up with your explanation second. Okay, so always give a direct answer first. As we go through the questions, I'll point it out to you. I'll say, okay, it's a good answer, but you should have given a direct answer first. I'll give, as we get to examples of it, and I'm sure there'll be once or twice when you make a mistake, I'll say, okay, but give the direct answer first and then your explanation afterwards. Some of the other examiners will only ask you maybe 6 or 8 questions, and they'll just allow you to keep answering and give long answers. So it's a big difference in style of questioning. As I say, it should be consistent between, everybody should do it the same way, because otherwise it's not fair on the people who've practiced doing those, answering in a certain way. But that, I'll highlight that when we get to that point. Okay, so the long talk, this is the one that everyone seems to dread, is doing the long talk, the part 2, where they give you a topic card, and there's some written instructions on there, including a topic, and it says you should say, and then it says and how you feel about it, and you get 1 minute to think about it, and they give you a pencil and paper so you can make some notes. I've seen, I watch very carefully with my students to see what they do in that 1 minute, and I've seen many students, they read the topic card, and then they sit back and they just try and keep themselves calm and sort their breathing out, and then they start talking, and then they've got nothing written down, and they forget what they were going to say, and so it becomes a bit of a mess. So in that 1 minute, you should use every second of that 1 minute to put some notes down about what it is you're going to talk about. While you've got no pressure on you, you should make some notes. And the notes, should be in the form of keywords. I've also watched people where they're trying to write the whole thing that they're going to say. They're trying to write everything down in 1 minute that they're going to say, and you haven't got time for that, you know. So, and not even phrases. I would just say keywords, you know, names of people, names of places, years, but just the key things that you're going to talk about. Yeah, names of places, that kind of thing. Just put some keywords down there, and ask yourself some other questions, because normally there's 3 bullet points which will say who you were with, when it happened, and where you went. But there are other questions that you can ask yourself, which I've written down there: who, what, when, where, why, and how. So ask yourself the other questions. It'll give you more to talk about. Okay, you don't have to restrict yourself to what's written down on the card. Obviously, the questions that are on the card are just to help you, to give you an idea. But you can add a lot more to it. And I would say, and this is why it's in red, bold, and underlined, the best way to answer part 2 is to actually tell a story. So if you look at the top line, the topic line, as soon as you get as soon as they give you that and they say you've got a minute to think about it, you should be thinking about, okay, what story can I tell that fits this topic? Because if you tell a story, you'll find that the 2 minutes is, you can tell a story in 2 minutes. What I normally see is that when people start just answering the questions and the bullet points, they run out of they answer each of the bullet points in order, which is not necessarily the natural way that you tell a story. And then they get to about 1 minute 20 seconds, 1 minute 30 seconds, and they've run out of things to say. And then they just sit there, and there's a silence for 30 seconds because the examiner can't say anything for 2 minutes. The rules that he has to follow there is that for the 2 minutes he doesn't say anything. They're just not allowed to, and it's being recorded, so they can't do it. And the only thing that they might do is they might just indicate, they might roll their hand like that to say you've still got time, keep talking. But not all of them do that either. So you should be trying to speak for the full 2 minutes, and the best way to do that is to actually tell a story about the topic. And so that's really the biggest advice I've got, is for part 2, telling stories, and we'll go through it over and over again as we practice with the different topics. And then we come to part 3. So part 3 is always linked to part 2. So if the topic that you get in part 2 is about describe your favorite teacher, for example, in part 3 it will be about education in general. So it's always linked in some way to what was in, but much more generally. So the difference with part 3 is, when I said in part 1 that most of the questions, like 80% of the questions in part 1 are about you and 20% are general. In part 3, it's the other way around. It's completely the other way around. Let's say 70% of the questions are about people in general, and 30% of the questions are about you. So again, you've got to listen carefully and answer the question: is it a general question or is it a question about you? And then you've got to answer it, in the appropriate fashion. So you need to listen to that and again, I hear people making that simple mistake so many times when I'm practicing with them, and they give me a very good answer, and I say, yes, but that you answered about you, and if the question was about people in general or people in your country or something like that. Okay, so again, it's something you need to pay special attention to it. Most of the questions in part 3 are broad concepts and ideas, comparing the past with the present or the present with the future. And they might say, how has education changed since your parents were in school compared to now? How do you think it will change in the future? So they're very broad concepts. And I've put a list of topics which I think come up quite often on there. So there's some links there which will take you to other pages. So because I mean, as a nurse, if all the questions were about healthcare, it would be very easy. It's a subject that you're familiar with. But with the other topics on there, you might not have any interest in the environment. You might not have any interest in transport or communication technology or computers. You might but you need to have something to say. You can't go into the exam and know nothing about it. And I'm sure you do know something. But then, it's how you answer the questions. You don't have to be an expert, and you can quite easily admit to the examiner. You shouldn't be afraid about admitting to the examiner, saying, look, as a nurse, I don't know much about transport or traffic. It's just not part of my job. However, I read an article in the BBC or the Guardian or CNN or wherever it was. I read an article about it recently, and they said this, blah 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 blah, and then you can talk about what it was that you saw on the internet. So you should do just a little bit of research, just so that you've got something to talk about to answer the questions. And say you don't have to be an expert, and you can admit to the examiner, well, I'm not an expert. As a nurse, it's not something I know much about. And also, okay, so let's get into the three things at the bottom of that page are strategies for answering questions. So the first one, very often they ask you which is more important, or which is better, or which would you prefer, and then they'll give you a choice of black and white, or big and small, or whatever it happens to be. They'll give you a choice of two different things. Which do you think is more important, or which do you think is better? And what people tend to do is they rehearse one answer. So they'll choose black, and they'll say, well, I think black is better because it's a better color of clothing, and blah, blah, blah. You can match it with anything, blah, blah, blah. They get to the end of their answer and they think, okay, I've practiced that answer. It's a good answer. And then the examiner will say, well, what about white? Don't you think white's important? And then they think, oh, I didn't practice anything with white, and I've got it wrong because the examiner's telling me it's white. It's not that at all. Okay. The examiner's just asking you to talk about the other one. So you shouldn't think you've made the wrong choice. But if you choose one, I can guarantee the examiner will choose the other one. Okay, so whatever you choose, they'll choose the opposite. So the best way to answer that question, where they give you a choice, is to actually say it depends. In some situations, black is better, but in other situations, white can be better. And then you give those examples of those situations. So you give a balanced, always when it asks you to choose between one and another, you always give a balanced answer and say, well, it depends. In some situations, and in other situations, or on the other hand, the other one's better. And if you give a balanced answer, the examiner can't sort of say, okay, what about the other one? Because you've talked about both of them. So it's a critical answer. It's a really important strategy for answering questions to say it depends. Then very often they have these questions, and again, I hear students, I ask them the question, like one of the questions, what kinds of television programs do you like watching? It's a very simple question. And what people do is they choose one type of television program, and they talk for a long time about one type. But the question was, what kinds, plural, of television programs, plural, do you like watching? So they want to have a range. They want to hear a whole range of things, not just one thing. So what you should do is give them a list. And you might at the end of having talked about a list, well, I like watching comedies, I like watching the news, I like watch documentaries, I like singing competitions, but my favorite one is this. And then you can talk about the one that's your favorite. That's a good answer. But if you just talk about one, you haven't answered the question, because it's asking in the plural. Okay, so again, as we do those questions, I'll remind you, well, what about the others? What about the others? What about the others? Tell me some more. Okay, and then sometimes it's a direct answer to a question, and you explain it in a lot of detail, and you give an alternative opinion, blah 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 blah. So it's another strategy for answering questions. But the two that I put first are the ones that I hear the most common mistakes from people. So I put them, sort of 1 and 2. Okay, if you look on the next page, you'll see the part that's in green. This is how you're being scored. This is what the examiner is actually listening for when you're doing the speaking. And I think the most important thing here is fluency and coherence. Fluency is that you continue talking with very little hesitation. You don't repeat yourself. You don't stop to think about what you're going to say next. You don't stop to choose your words. That basically, and it's in a logical sequence that you start off. If you're talking about something, the easiest way to do a logical sequence is to say, well, in the first place I do this, and then secondly I do this, and then finally I do this, and then. So if you talk about things in a time sequence, like to begin with, and then later, and then finally, then you're going to give it logical. You're going to give it a logical coherence. That gives you your coherence, because it's a logical sequence. So it's the most important part, I think, because that's how speaking works. That's how you communicate effectively with speaking. Lexical resource, the mistake that most students make with lexical resource is they try to impress the examiner with long, complicated words. They think if I use very high academic vocabulary, the examiner will be impressed. But there's a problem with that, which is it's not what the exam's asking for. It doesn't ask for high academic language. And that's because what it says is idiomatic use of English is the actual phrase it uses, idiomatic use of English. And if you had you said you had this is why I asked whether you had a Filipino tutor. I know a lot of Filipino tutors teach you a whole list of idioms. I know that's not what it means.
Yeah.
They don't want you to talk about raining cats of dogs or burning the midnight oil or all the things that Filipinos teach you. That's not what it's asking. What it means is conversational language. It's how I'm talking to you now. I'm not using lots of idioms. I'm
Yeah.
not using high academic language. I'm explaining things to you in the clearest way possible so that you can understand it. Yes. So and that's what they're looking for. It's conversational language. That's what idiomatic use of English means. Okay. And again, I see people, they're always hesitating because they think, oh, I know a better word. What's that word? And they're trying to think of that word, and they're hesitating. And when they're hesitating, your score's going down all the time you're hesitating. Use the simple word. Don't look for the high academic word. Use the simple word and maintain your fluency. That's how you get a good score. Okay, so don't worry about, as long basically, I mean, they want to see that you can use some synonyms rather than using the same word over and over again. But don't let that interrupt your fluency. If you've got a very broad vocabulary and you can throw things, but there is a danger with that as well, which is that people, even if you look in a dictionary or if you look in a thesaurus, you'll see a list of words that are the same, a list of synonyms in a thesaurus, but they don't all mean exactly the same thing. They are nearly the same meaning. And so if you keep changing the word all the way through your discussion or through your essay, you think, oh, I need to use another word, I need to use another word, you're going to end up using words that aren't exactly the same, and then it becomes confusing because as a reader or a listener, I'll be thinking, are you still talking about the same thing? Because you've changed the meaning of the word. It's slightly different. So you know using a synonym once or twice is fair enough, but don't try to do it every single time you mention whatever it is that you're talking about. Keep it simple. Really keep it simple. Aim for fluency. That's the most important thing. Grammar, range, and accuracy. Again, people get very stressed about this because they think they're going to make a lot of mistakes and they're worried about the mistakes that they make. If you actually read what it says about speaking on how they score it for level 7, it says makes occasional mistakes. So they're expecting at level 7 that you will make occasional mistakes. The important thing is, can they still understand you? Is the grammatical mistake so big that they just don't know what you're talking about, or is it just a minor mistake and it's okay, well, just carry on talking. Don't worry about it. They are expecting to hear some mistakes, and you can still get 7. In fact, a year ago, one of my students, who was a very, very confident speaker, but she made quite a lot of mistakes. She did make quite a lot of grammatical mistakes, and she got 8. Okay, so she wasn't a nurse, actually. She was a business studies from Korea. But she got 8, and I tell you now, she did make mistakes. I had somebody else recently who got 7.5, and I know from experience that she also made mistakes. So don't really worry too much about either your grammar. I mean, obviously you should try to get it right, but don't panic about it. And again, the problem is people make a mistake and they think, oh, I've made a mistake.
Yeah.
Their confidence disappears, and they think, okay, I've wasted it, I've messed it up. I might as well give up and walk out now. Just keep going. Just keep on going. Keep on talking. Don't worry about your mistakes. Just keep talking, and you can push through it. It's only going to really bring your score down if you make the same mistake over and over again. Then obviously they'll notice it. But if it's one mistake or 2 mistakes, you can still get a high score with it. Pronunciation, it's the same thing. I mean, with pronunciation, it's as long as they can understand you, you don't have to try and speak with a native English accent or anything like that. It's really about, can they understand what you're saying?